Hi, I'm Johnny with Vigilante Intelligence. Today, we're going to look into a foreign country that has been able to infiltrate the NSA. We're going to start off with an article from Wired, titled, Shady Companies with Ties to Israel Wiretap the US for the NSA. Written by James Bamford, an award-winning and best-selling author, famous for his writings about intelligence agencies, particularly the NSA. At AT&T, the wiretapping rooms are powered by software and hardware from Narus. Narus was formed in Israel in November 1997 by 6 Israelis, with much of its money coming from Walden, Israel, an Israeli venture capital company. Its founder and former chairman, Ori Cohen, once told Israel's Fortune magazine that his partners have done technology work for Israeli intelligence. The company says its equipment is capable of providing unparalleled monitoring and intercept capabilities to service providers and government organizations around the world, and that anything that comes through an internet protocol network, we can record. We can reconstruct all of their emails, along with attachments, see what web pages they clicked on. We can reconstruct their voice over IP calls. Verint, which is owned by Comverse Technology, taps the communication lines at Verizon. Like Narus, Verint was founded in Israel by Israelis, including Jacob Kobi Alexander, a former Israeli intelligence officer. Oded Maimon, one of the world's foremost experts on data mining and artificial intelligence, advised Verint, and in 2008, he was awarded a medal by the Mossad for his services to the nation. Like other Israeli mathematics professors, he has worked for both the intelligence services and the private sector. Verint has received multiple honors for its facial recognition technology. Using Verint Face Detect, organizations can identify persons of interest, regardless of face obstructions, aging, disguises, and ethnicity. It also features real-time and forensic comparison capabilities against large databases with millions of faces and can instantaneously add individuals to watch lists. These are companies founded in Israel with ties to Israeli intelligence. NSA contracts are being given to a foreign country which has got caught spying and has openly committed terrorism against the United States multiple times. Jonathan Pollard pled guilty to spying and was sentenced to life imprisonment, mainly because Israel traded those secrets to the Soviet Union. Israeli officials actually had the chutzpah to say that they stopped spying on the United States after the Pollard arrest. In a rare and candid admission to Forbes, retired Brigadier General Hanan Geffen, a former commander of the highly secret Unit 8200, Israel's NSA, noted his former organization's influence on Comverse, which owns Verint, as well as other Israeli companies that dominate the US eavesdropping and surveillance market. Take Nice, Comverse, and Checkpoint for example, 3 of the largest high-tech companies, which were all directly influenced by 8200 technology. Checkpoint was co-founded by a Talpiot graduate, Marius Nacht, and Nice Systems runs the servers for Verizon. They became well known after they decided to leave the information of millions of customers on an unprotected server. According to a former chief of Unit 8200, both the veterans of the group and much of the high-tech intelligence equipment they developed are now employed in high-tech firms around the world.
Israel steals technology, steals secrets from the United States.
Giraldi is the executive director of the Council for the National Interest Foundation, which just released a 12-page overview written by Giraldi called The Spy Who Loves Us. He says Israel conducts more espionage against America than any other U.S. ally.
It should almost be seen like an act of war.
Giraldi says Israel profits from selling U.S. technology.
It gets really serious when Israel uses these technologies and sells them to countries that are not friendly to the United States. I would cite the example of a Chinese jet, the J-10, which was built with a lot of technology that came originally from the United States.
Giraldi says Israeli spying has bankrupted some American companies.
I'll get phone calls from people actually who worked for companies that went out of business because Israel had stolen their technology and done that sort of thing, and the company goes bankrupt.
Unit 8200 veterans have set up some 30 to 40 high-tech companies, including 5 to 10 that were floated on Wall Street. Referred to only as Brigadier General B, he added, this correlation between serving in the Intelligence Unit 8200 and starting successful high-tech companies is not coincidental. Many of the technologies in use around the world and developed in Israel were originally military technologies that were developed and improved by unit veterans. Students in Israel's Talpiot program and Unit 8200, as well as select students in Technion, are trained by military intelligence. After they graduate, they start cybersecurity and telecommunications companies all over the world, mostly in the United States. Having access to all your data allows a foreign country to blackmail whoever they want, commit terrorism, which Verint did on 7/7. It allows them to aid organized crime and steal technology, which they then sell to Russia and China. Now we're going to look at Carl Cameron's report on Comverse Infosys. This was banned by Fox News, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch and does not allow any criticism of Israel.
As Carl Cameron reported, U.S. investigators digging into the 9/11 terrorist attacks fear that suspects may have been tipped off to what they were doing by information leaking out of Amdocs. In tonight's report, we learned that the concern about phone security extends to another company founded in Israel that provides the technology that the U.S. government uses for electronic eavesdropping. Here is Carl Cameron's third report.
The company is Comverse Infosys, a subsidiary of an Israeli-run private telecommunications firm with offices throughout the U.S. It provides wiretapping equipment for law enforcement. Here's how wiretapping works in the U.S. Every time you make a call, it passes through the nation's elaborate network of switchers and routers run by the phone companies. Custom computers and software made by companies like Comverse are tied into that network to intercept, record, and store the wiretapped calls, and at the same time transmit them to investigators. The manufacturers have continuing access to the computers so they can service them and keep them free of glitches. This process was authorized by the 1994 Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA. Senior government officials have now told Fox News that while CALEA made wiretapping easier, it has led to a system that is seriously vulnerable to compromise and may have undermined the whole wiretapping system. Indeed, Fox News has learned that Attorney General John Ashcroft and FBI Director Robert Mueller were both warned October 18th in a hand-delivered letter from 15 local, state, and federal law enforcement officials who complained that, quote, law enforcement's current electronic surveillance capabilities are less effective today than they were at the time CALEA was enacted. Comverse insists the equipment it installs is secure, but the complaint about this system is that the wiretap computer programs made by Comverse have in effect a back door through which wiretaps themselves can be intercepted by unauthorized parties. Adding to the suspicions is the fact that in Israel, Comverse works closely with the Israeli government and under special programs gets reimbursed for up to 50% of its research and development costs by the Israeli Ministry of Industry and Trade. But investigators within the DEA, INS, and FBI have all told Fox News that to pursue or even suggest Israeli spying through Comverse is considered career suicide. And sources say that while various FBI inquiries into Comverse have been conducted over the years, they've been halted before the actual equipment has ever been thoroughly tested for leaks. A 1999 FCC document indicates several government agencies expressed deep concerns that too many unauthorized, non-law enforcement personnel can access the wiretap system. And what troubles investigators most, particularly in New York in the counterterrorism investigation of the World Trade Center attack, is that on a number of cases, suspects that they had sought to wiretap and surveil immediately changed their telecommunications processes. They started acting much differently as soon as those supposedly secret wiretaps went into place. Brett?
They sold the FBI surveillance equipment. Then, that same equipment was used to aid Israeli organized crime.
Los Angeles, 1997. A major local, state, and federal drug investigation sours. The suspects? Israeli organized crime, with operations in New York, Miami, Las Vegas, Canada, Israel, and Egypt. The allegations? Cocaine and ecstasy trafficking and sophisticated white-collar credit card and computer fraud. The problem? According to classified law enforcement documents obtained by Fox News, the bad guys had the cops' beepers, cell phones, even home phones under surveillance. Some who did get caught admitted to having hundreds of numbers and using them to avoid arrest. Quote, this compromised law enforcement communications between LAPD detectives and other assigned law enforcement officers working various aspects of the case. The organization discovered communications between Organized Crime Intelligence Division detectives, the FBI, and the Secret Service. Shock spread from the DEA to the FBI in Washington and then the CIA. An investigation of the problem, according to law enforcement documents, concluded, quote, the organization has apparent extensive access to database systems to identify pertinent personal and biographical information. When investigators tried to find out where the information might have come from, they looked at Amdocs, a publicly traded firm based in Israel. Amdocs generates billing data for virtually every call in America, and they do credit checks. The company denies any leaks, but investigators still fear that the firm's data is getting into the wrong hands. When investigators checked their own wiretapping system for leaks, they grew concerned about potential vulnerabilities in the computers that intercept, record, and store the wiretapped calls. A main contractor is Comverse Infosys, which works closely with the Israeli government and under a special grant program is reimbursed for up to 50% of its research and development costs by Israel's Ministry of Industry and Trade. Asked this week about another sprawling investigation and the detention of 60 Israelis since September 11th, the Bush administration treated the questions like hot potatoes.
Comverse and Amdocs were used to aid organized crime. Amdocs was founded by a Technion graduate, Avi Neor. According to former State Department official Jonathan Weiner, all 75 of the top Russian and Ukrainian crime kingpins the U.S. government was tracking worldwide at the end of the 1990s were citizens of Israel. They are significantly more educated and worldly than their Colombian, Mexican, or American counterparts, and they have access to financial and technological resources in Russia and Ukraine not readily available to Colombian, Mexican, or Cosa Nostra criminal organizations. Russian and Ukrainian mobsters are also much more violent than their Colombian or Mexican counterparts, according to U.S. law enforcement sources. In fact, Israeli law enforcement officials estimate that Russian and Ukrainian syndicates have invested between $4 billion and $20 billion in the Israeli economy since the 1970s. Some Israeli law enforcement officials also believe that up to 10% of the more than 800,000 Russian Jews who settled in Israel during the past 30 years are involved in organized criminal enterprises, mainly in other countries. Mafia leaders are also believed to have contributed more than $1.5 million to former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's campaign in 1996, with introductions arranged by Russian-born Natan Sharansky, leader of the Russian Yisrael Ba'aliyah and Interior Minister in Ehud Barak's government. As Prime Minister, he terminated an investigation of Russian and Ukrainian crime syndicate penetration of Israel's economy and government, which had been launched as a result of police chief leader's June 1996 intelligence assessment. The investigation has not been revived. Over 20 years later, Israeli police recommend charging Netanyahu in third corruption case. Let's look at some more collusion between Bibi's government and organized crime. Kobe Alexander was serving a prison sentence in the US for fraud charges. In November, he appealed to be transferred to an Israeli prison where he could have a third of his term reduced for good behavior. 3 weeks later, he was released from prison. Having an Israeli passport is essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card.
And the FBI's own nondescript office in Chantilly, Virginia, that actually oversees the Kalia wiretapping program, is among the most agitated about the threat. But there is a bitter turf war internally at FBI. It is the FBI's office in Quantico, Virginia, that has jurisdiction over awarding contracts and buying intercept equipment. And for years, they've thrown much of the business to Comverse. A handful of former U.S. law enforcement officials involved in awarding Comverse government contracts over the years now work for the company. Numerous sources say some of those individuals were asked to leave government service under what knowledgeable sources call troublesome circumstances that remain under administrative review within the Justice Department.
As you just heard in Carl Cameron's report, some law enforcement officials were being bribed to buy Comverse and then went on to work for the company. 17 years later, that practice is still going on. Some former National Security Agency officials have strongly criticized ex-NSA Director Admiral Michael Rogers' decision to join the advisory board of a venture capital firm that is closely linked with an Israeli intelligence agency. The company, Team 8, announced Rogers' position last week. Founded by former members of the elite Israeli Army intelligence group known as Unit 8200. Rogers, who headed NSA and US Cyber Command for 4 years before stepping down this past May, will advise companies in Team 8's portfolio as well as companies under development. The retired admiral will be instrumental in helping strategize Team 8's expansion in the United States, the firm said in a statement last week. Robert Lee, a former Air Force officer and former NSA employee, tweeted, "Former senior government officials, especially the head of our most significant intelligence agency, profiting from that experience to work with foreign intel-backed companies, bothers me on a deep level." Mark Hertling, former commanding general of US Army Europe, seconded Lee's comment by tweeting, "Me too." There is no clear line, Lee told Cyberscoop, but the former director of one of our most critical intelligence agencies joining a foreign company headed by the ex-head of a foreign intelligence agency crosses whatever line exists, in my opinion. Jake Williams, a veteran of NSA's Tailored Access Operations Hacking Unit, also criticized Rogers' new position. Rogers is not being brought into this role because of his technical experience. Williams asserted in an email to Cyberscoop, it's purely because of his knowledge of classified operations and his ability to influence many in the US government and private sector contractors. Team 8 CEO Nadav Zafrir, former commander of Unit 8200, said Rogers would be key to the firm's work. Share this video, especially to patriots in the intelligence community. If you really enjoy my work, make sure to donate so I can do this more often. It does feel good to be back. Cheers.